The summer of 1873 burned across the Arizona territory like God's own furnace. The land stretched endless and unforgiving, a vast expanse of red earth and sage that had belonged to the Chiricahua Apache since time immemorial. But the white man had come with his papers and his rifles, and he called this land his own. Joshua Whitmore stood on the porch of his ranch house, surveying the valley with the satisfied eyes of a conqueror. His weathered hands gripped the wooden railing as he watched his hired men drive fence posts into ground that had never known boundaries. Behind him, his wife Martha prepared supper, the smell of salt pork drifting through the evening air. "This'll be something," Joshua muttered to his foreman, a scarred veteran named Dutch Keller. 3,000 acres of prime grazing land. We'll be the biggest outfit in the territory. Dutch spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Them Apaches ain't gonna like it much. This here's their hunting ground." Joshua's jaw tightened. "The Apache don't own nothing. Government says this land's open for homesteading. We got papers, legal and proper." What Joshua didn't say, what he didn't need to say, was that those papers had been signed in Washington by men who'd never set foot in Arizona, men who'd drawn lines on maps as if the people who'd lived here for centuries were nothing more than inconvenient animals to be relocated or exterminated. 3 miles to the north, in a canyon carved by ancient waters, the Apache warrior Nietzsche sat with his uncle, the war leader Cochise's youngest brother. They watched smoke rise from the white man's settlement, watched the fence posts go up like grave markers across the land where their fathers had hunted deer and their mothers had gathered piñon nuts. "They take more each season," Nietzsche said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. He was 23 summers old, his face already marked by the hardness that came from watching his world collapse. "First the miners, then the cattle ranchers. Now they put up fences like we are animals to be kept out of our own home." The older warrior, whose name was Taza, nodded slowly. "The Americans speak with snake tongues. They promised us land, promised us peace, but their promises are like morning mist, gone when the sun rises." The Apache had tried to adapt. After years of bloody warfare, they'd accepted reservation life, taken the government rations, tried to walk the white man's road. But the reservations were prisons with invisible walls, and the rations were contaminated flour and rancid meat that made children sick. The agents who were supposed to protect them stole from them instead, selling off their supplies and pocketing the money. And still the whites wanted more. More land, more gold, more of everything until there would be nothing left. That night, Nietzsche rode down to the edge of Whitmore's property. He didn't come to make war, not yet. He came to speak, to try one last time to make the white man understand. He brought with him 2 other warriors, Mangas and Delgadito, both young men who'd grown up watching their people diminished. They found Joshua Whitmore drinking whiskey on his porch, a rifle across his lap. "You're on my land," Joshua called out, standing slowly. His hand moved toward the rifle. Nietzsche raised his palm in a gesture of peace, though every fiber of his being resisted the submission implicit in the act. "We come to talk. This land is mine," Joshua interrupted. "I got the papers to prove it. Now get off it before I shoot you for trespassing." "Your papers mean nothing," Nietzsche said, his English careful and precise. He'd learned it from the missionaries who'd tried to steal their children's souls along with their language. "Our people have lived here for generations beyond counting. We buried our dead in these hills. Our gods live in these mountains." Joshua laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "Your gods ain't worth spit, boy. This is American territory now. You want to live here, you go to the reservation like the government says." "The reservation is death," Nietzsche replied. "Slow death from bad food and broken spirits. We ask only to hunt, to live as we have always lived. There is room for both our peoples. There ain't room for savages who don't respect property rights," Joshua said. He raised his rifle now, pointing it casually at Nietzsche's chest. "I'm going to count to 10. If you ain't gone by then, I'm gonna start shooting. 1, 2... Naiche held his ground for a moment longer, his dark eyes locked with Whitmore's pale blue ones. In that moment, each man saw in the other something irredeemable. Joshua saw a primitive obstacle to civilization's march, and Naiche saw the embodiment of everything that was destroying his world. They left without violence that night, but the seeds of bloodshed had been planted. 2 weeks later, 3 of Whitmore's cattle were found dead, their throats cut, their bodies left to rot in the sun. Joshua was convinced it was the Apache, though there was no proof. He rode into town, a scattered collection of buildings called Sulphur Springs, and gathered a posse. "We're gonna teach them red devils a lesson," he told the assembled men at the saloon. 15 men volunteered, most of them ranchers and miners who saw the Apache as vermin to be exterminated. They armed themselves with rifles and revolvers, with rope and with hate. They rode out at dawn, following tracks that might have been Apache or might have been wild horses. None of them were skilled enough trackers to tell the difference, but that didn't matter. They found an Apache camp by mid-morning, a small group of families living in traditional wickiups, trying to survive off the increasingly scarce game. There were no warriors in the camp, just old men, women, and children. The warriors were out hunting, trying to find food for their families. Joshua hesitated for only a moment. "They're probably hiding the bucks," he told his men. "Search every shelter. Anyone gives you trouble, you shoot." What happened next would be remembered differently by those who were there. Joshua would later claim they were fired upon first, that it was self-defense. But the Apache survivors would tell a different story, one of women being dragged from their homes, of children crying as they watched their grandparents beaten, of rifle butts smashing into faces and bullets fired into unarmed bodies. An old woman named Nalin tried to protect her grandchildren. Dutch Keller shot her in the stomach and left her to die slowly in the dirt, her blood soaking into the land she'd lived on for 70 years. By the time the posse rode away, 7 Apache lay dead or dying, including 3 children. They'd found no evidence of who killed the cattle, no stolen property, nothing but a small group of people trying to survive. When Naiche and the other warriors returned to find the massacre, the sound that rose from them was beyond language. A howling grief and rage that echoed off the canyon walls. Naiche knelt beside Nalin's body, holding the old woman who had helped raise him, and something inside him broke forever. "No more talking," he said, his voice deadly calm now. "No more believing in the white man's peace. They want war. We give them war." Taza tried to counsel patience, tried to remind him that open warfare would bring the full force of the American cavalry down upon them. But Naiche was beyond hearing. He'd tried the white man's way. He'd tried peace, tried negotiation, tried to believe in a world where both peoples could exist. But the whites had shown him the truth. They wouldn't be satisfied until every Apache was dead or broken. The next night, they struck back. Whitmore's ranch was isolated, dependent on a single well for water. The Apache poisoned it with the rotting carcass of a coyote, then waited. When Whitmore's men came out sick and weakened, the warriors attacked. But Naiche had given strict orders. They would kill only the men who had been part of the posse. He remembered each face from that night when they'd come to talk peace. The battle lasted 3 hours. Dutch Keller died with an arrow through his throat, drowning in his own blood. 2 other ranch hands were killed outright. Joshua Whitmore barricaded himself in his house with Martha and fought from the windows, his rifle cracking in the darkness. As dawn broke, the Apache withdrew. They'd made their point, exacted their revenge. But Naiche knew it wasn't over. It was only beginning. Joshua Whitmore survived, but something had changed in him. The casual cruelty that had marked his treatment of the Apache before had calcified into pure hatred. He sent word to the territorial governor, to the army, to anyone who would listen. The Apache had to be destroyed, completely and utterly. Within a week, 2 companies of cavalry arrived in Sulphur Springs.
Captain James Worthington of the 6th Cavalry arrived in Sulphur Springs with orders that were as clear as they were brutal. Pacify the hostile Apache by any means necessary. He was a West Point graduate, 32 years old, with a thin mustache and eyes that had seen too much death in the Civil War to be shocked by anything anymore. Joshua Whitmore met him at the makeshift fort, his arm still bandaged from the Apache raid. "They're animals, Captain. Pure savages. They killed good Christian men in cold blood." Worthington listened to Joshua's account, noting what the rancher left out: the massacre at the Apache camp, the poisoned well, the cycle of violence that both sides fed with equal fervor. But Worthington's orders didn't require him to judge. They required him to win. "How many warriors are we dealing with?" Worthington asked. "Could be 50, could be 100, Joshua replied. "They hide in the mountains like rats. But I know their hunting grounds, their water sources. Give me some men and I'll lead you right to them." Worthington nodded slowly. "We'll move out at first light. But understand this, Mr. Whitmore. When we engage the enemy, you follow my orders. This is a military operation, not a lynching party." Joshua smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Whatever you say, Captain." In the mountains, Nietzsche and his warriors prepared for what they knew was coming. Scouts had reported the cavalry's arrival, counted their numbers, assessed their weapons. The Apache were outnumbered and outgunned, but they knew this land in a way the white soldiers never could. Every canyon, every hidden spring, every game trail was part of their collective memory going back generations. Taza argued for retreat, for fleeing deeper into Mexico, where the American army couldn't legally follow. "We cannot win this war," he told Nietzsche. "The whites are too many, like stars in the sky. Every soldier we kill, 10 more will come. We must think of the women and children." "I am thinking of them," Nietzsche replied. "If we run, we spend our lives running. Our children will grow up knowing only fear and flight. Better to die fighting than to live as broken things on the reservation." But Nietzsche's resolve was cracking, even if he wouldn't admit it. He'd seen the faces of the children when they'd buried Nalin, seen the fear in the women's eyes. This wasn't the glorious warfare of his grandfather's time, when Apache warriors were the terror of the Southwest. This was extinction, dressed up in uniforms and justified by papers written in a language most of his people couldn't read. The cavalry found their first Apache camp 3 days later. It was abandoned. The people had fled into the higher elevations, taking only what they could carry. Worthington ordered the camp burned, the food stores destroyed. It was a strategy he'd learned fighting the Confederacy. Deny the enemy resources, make it impossible for them to sustain themselves. Joshua Whitmore looked at the burning wiki-ups with satisfaction. That's how you handle savages, make them starve. But Worthington felt something else, a hollow disgust that he buried beneath military discipline. These weren't enemy soldiers, these were families. The wiki-ups contained children's toys made from sticks and stones, grinding stones used by grandmothers, the accumulated small treasures of people trying to live. He thought of his own family back in Virginia, wondered what they would think if they knew what he was doing in the name of civilization. The Apache struck back that night, attacking the cavalry's supply wagons. They killed 4 soldiers and disappeared into the darkness before reinforcements could arrive. Nietzsche led the raid himself, his heart singing with fierce joy, even as part of him mourned the necessity of it all. The war of attrition continued for weeks. The cavalry would find an Apache position. The Apache would vanish before they could be engaged. Apache warriors would ambush patrols, kill a few soldiers, then fade into the landscape. The soldiers grew exhausted and demoralized, jumpy at every shadow. Joshua Whitmore grew increasingly frustrated. "We're not hitting them hard enough," he told Worthington. "We need to make examples. Hang a few of them where the others can see." "We're not in the business of making examples, Mr. Whitmore," Worthington replied coldly. "We're here to restore order, not commit atrocities." But Joshua had his own plans. He'd recruited a group of civilians, miners and ranchers who'd lost property to Apache raids, and formed an unofficial militia. They called themselves the Arizona Rangers, though they had no legal authority. What they had was guns and hatred and Joshua Whitmore's money. They found an Apache woman named Desba, gathering herbs in a canyon. She was 40 years old, a healer who'd never raised a weapon against anyone. Joshua's rangers surrounded her, and what they did to her before they killed her was something that haunted even the hardest men among them for the rest of their lives. They left her body displayed on a rock, a warning to other Apache. But the message they sent was different from what they intended. It told the Apache that there would be no mercy, no quarter, no possibility of peace. When Nietzsche found Desba's body, something fundamental broke in the fragile structure of his humanity. She'd been his cousin, had delivered half the babies in their band, had saved his life once when he was a boy and fever had nearly taken him. The mutilations inflicted on her body spoke of a hatred so profound that it transcended warfare. It was genocide dressed up as manifest destiny. Now, Nietzsche told his warriors, now we show them what Apache justice means. The attack on Joshua Whitmore's ranch came 3 nights later. This time, there would be no distinction between combatants and civilians, no mercy for those who'd shown none. 20 Apache warriors surrounded the ranch house at midnight, and Nietzsche himself set fire to the barn. Joshua and Martha Whitmore died together, fighting from their bedroom window. Joshua got off 3 shots before an arrow took him in the chest. Martha loaded his rifle with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face, until a bullet ended her life. She was 28 years old, had come west dreaming of building a life on the frontier, and died terrified in the darkness, paying for her husband's sins with her own blood. The ranch hands fled or died. By dawn, everything Joshua Whitmore had built was ashes and corpses. When Captain Worthington rode out to investigate, he found a scene of devastation. But he also found something else. A letter Martha had been writing to her sister back in Ohio, left half-finished on a desk. In it, she'd written about her fears, about Joshua's increasing violence, about her desire to leave Arizona, but her inability to convince her husband to abandon his dreams of empire. Worthington read the letter and felt something shift inside him. These weren't battles between armies. This was a cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. And he knew which side had the numbers to survive. He made a decision that would end his military career. He sent a message to Nietzsche through an Apache scout who'd remained neutral, a man who still believed in the possibility of peace. The message was simple: meet me alone and let us talk. Nietzsche almost didn't come. Trust had been murdered along with Desba, along with Nalin, along with too many others. But Taza convinced him to try one last time. If we don't talk, we die. All of us. The women, the children, everyone. They met in a canyon at sunset, 2 men who'd become the embodiments of their people's conflict. Worthington came unarmed, though his soldiers were stationed a mile away, ready to attack if it was a trap. Nietzsche came with his rifle, but he left it on his horse as a gesture of good faith. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the Apache warrior who'd watched his world die, and the cavalry officer who'd been ordered to kill it. "I can't stop what's coming," Worthington said finally. "More soldiers will come, and more after that. The government has decided your people don't have the right to exist as you are. I'm sorry, but that's the truth." Nietzsche nodded slowly. "I know. I've always known. But what am I supposed to do? Watch my people become beggars? Watch our children forget who they are?" "I can offer you this," Worthington said. "Surrender. Come to the reservation. I'll personally guarantee fair treatment, adequate rations, respect for your customs. It's not freedom, but it's survival." "Survival as what?" Nietzsche asked. "As shadows of ourselves? As things to be pitied. As people who might live to see their grandchildren grow old," Worthington replied. "Your grandfather Cochise made peace. He knew when to fight and when to survive. This is a time for survival." Nietzsche was silent for a long time. In his mind, he saw Nalin's face, Desba's broken body, the burning wickiups, the children's fearful eyes. He thought of his own son, just 3 years old, who'd never known a time when the Apache were free. What kind of father would he be if he chose pride over his son's chance at life? "If I surrender," Nietzsche said finally, "what happens to the men like Whitmore, the ones who killed our people without reason?" Worthington couldn't meet his eyes. "Nothing. They'll face no justice. The law doesn't protect Indians the way it protects whites. You know that. Yes, Nietzsche said bitterly. I know that. But he also knew that continued fighting meant certain death for everyone he loved. The Apache way of life was already dead. The only question was whether the Apache people would survive to remember it. 2 weeks later, Nietzsche led his band to the reservation. 43 people, all that remained of a community that had once numbered in the hundreds. They came with their heads high, refusing to show the breaking of their spirits, even as their hearts shattered with every step. Captain Worthington kept his promise. He ensured they received adequate rations, protected them from the worst abuses of the corrupt reservation agents. It wasn't much, but it was something. Joshua Whitmore's land was claimed by another rancher within a month. The fence posts still stood, marking boundaries that meant nothing to the wind and everything to the law. The Apache were allowed to visit their traditional burial grounds once a year, supervised by soldiers, like tourists in their own homeland. Nietzsche lived another 40 years on the reservation. He taught his children the old ways, the old stories, kept alive what fragments he could of their heritage. He never spoke of the war years, never told the stories of violence and revenge. Those memories he carried alone, a weight that bent his shoulders as he aged. In 1923, a historian came to interview him, to record the Apache perspective on the Apache Wars. Nietzsche was 73 then, his face a map of hard years, his eyes still sharp, but infinitely sad. Was it worth it? The historian asked. The fighting? The resistance? Nietzsche was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "We did what we had to do. The whites did what they wanted to do. That is the difference between justice and power. But my grandchildren are alive. They go to school, they learn English, they will survive in this new world. Perhaps that is worth everything. Perhaps it is worth nothing. I will know when I die and see the faces of all those who came before." He died 6 months later in his sleep, an old man in a world that had moved on without him. His grave was marked with a simple stone on the reservation, his name spelled wrong by the white administrator who ordered it made. But the Apache remember him, remember all of them, remember the price paid for survival. The land that Joshua Whitmore died for is now a national park. Tourists drive through it in air-conditioned cars, marveling at the savage beauty of the landscape, never knowing about the blood that soaked into this red earth, never hearing the ghosts that still whisper in the wind. History calls it the Apache Wars, makes it sound clean and distant. But it wasn't a war, it was a slaughter, a cultural extinction, a choice between dying free or living broken. Both sides bled, both sides suffered, but only one side had the power to write the history, to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. The land remembers, though. The land always remembers.